My mother smiled at me across 40 people and said it like a fact. Not everyone in this family has the follow-through. The table laughed. I didn't correct her, because Uncle Mark was sitting at the end of that table. And Uncle Mark had spent 6 months trying to secretly acquire my company. And he had absolutely no idea that I knew. And my mother had just handed me the room. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My mother's name is Patricia Calloway, and she has never once in her 63 years on this earth introduced me to anyone without a qualifier attached. Not this is my daughter Elena. Not this is Elena. She built a company from scratch. Not even just Elena, standing alone without footnote or asterisk. It was always this is my daughter Elena. She's the creative one, which in our family's private language meant she is the one who does not have a real job. Or this is Elena. She's still figuring things out. Delivered with the specific fondness of someone who considers your life an ongoing cautionary tale they have made their peace with. Or, at my cousin's wedding when I was 29 and had already been running my own business for 3 years, this is Elena. You know how artists are, spoken to a man in a suit who nodded with the practiced sympathy of someone being warned about a mild inconvenience. I am not an artist. I am the founder and majority owner of a product development consultancy that I built from a folding table in a 1-bedroom apartment in Austin, Texas, into a firm with 11 full-time employees, a roster of clients whose names you would recognize if I said them, an evaluation that I am going to get to in this story at exactly the right moment. But my mother did not know that. My mother knew what I had told her, which was that I ran a small consulting business, because I had learned over 37 years of being Patricia Calloway's daughter that the most efficient way to protect something you have built is to keep it away from the people who have a history of making you feel like you cannot build things. I need to take you back before I take you forward, because the woman who sat at that graduation party table and did not flinch when her mother said, "Not everyone in this family has the follow-through," did not arrive at that composure accidentally. She built it the same way she built everything else, deliberately, over time, from materials that most people would have thrown away. I was the second of 3 children. My older brother, Calloway. Yes, my mother gave her firstborn her maiden name, which tells you something about the organizational structure of our family, was the one my parents understood. He was linear. He was legible. He went to state school, studied business, joined a firm, made junior partner, bought a house 12 minutes from my parents' house in Scottsdale, and produced 2 children who sat still at dinner. My mother referred to Calloway's life as sensible, which was the highest compliment available in her vocabulary. My younger sister Dana was the beautiful one, which is a different kind of diminishment, but a diminishment nonetheless. And Dana had navigated it by marrying well at 26 and channeling all of her considerable intelligence into the management of a social life that my mother approved of and therefore never examined too closely. And then there was me, Elena, the creative one, the still figuring it out one, the one who had changed her major twice and left a corporate job at 26 to start something my mother referred to as Elena's little project for approximately 4 years before she stopped asking about it entirely, which was somehow worse than the asking. The specific texture of being dismissed by a parent is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it because it does not feel like one thing. It feels like weather, like a climate you live inside, where individual days vary, but the overall condition is consistent and has been consistent for so long that you have stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the temperature of a room you have been sitting in for hours. It was my mother asking about Calloway's promotion for 12 minutes at Thanksgiving and then asking about my work for 45 seconds before pivoting to whether I was seeing anyone. It was my father, who was quieter about it, but no less consistent, telling a family friend that Elena does her own thing when the friend asked what I did, which contained within it the specific implication that my own thing was categorically different from a real thing. It was Christmas when I was 32, 3 years into building something that was starting to actually work, when my mother gave Calloway a leather portfolio embossed with his name because he had made partner and gave me a book called Finding Your Path, a guide for late bloomers, which I kept because I found it genuinely useful and also because I felt that keeping it was more psychologically sophisticated than throwing it away. And then there was Uncle Mark. I want to be careful about how I introduce Uncle Mark because he is not a cartoon villain, and the story is less interesting if I present him as one. He is my mother's younger brother, 61 years old, self-made in the specific American way that involves a combination of genuine capability and strategic relationship management, the founder of a mid-sized private equity firm based in Phoenix that specialized in acquiring and scaling product and service companies in the $10 to $50 million revenue range. He was charming in rooms. He was precise in deals. He had a way of making you feel, in conversation, like you were the most interesting person he had encountered recently. And if you were not paying attention to what his eyes were doing while his mouth was being charming, you might not notice that his eyes were always working. I had been paying attention to Uncle Mark since I was 19 years old, and he had talked me out of a business idea at a family dinner by asking questions that sounded like interest, but were structured like an audit. And by the end of the conversation, I had somehow concluded that the idea was not viable, and 2 years later, I watched someone else execute a version of it successfully. I filed that away. I filed things away. It is, depending on who you ask, either my greatest professional asset or my most exhausting personal quality. Now, I want to stop for just a second because I know this story is reaching people in a lot of different places, and I genuinely want to know where you're watching from right now. Drop your city or your country in the comments. I'll be reading them, because what I'm about to tell you about how I found out what Uncle Mark had been doing is the part that changed everything, and I want to know who's in the room for it. I found out about Uncle Mark's interest in my company 7 months before the graduation party. Not through a phone call, not through a mutual contact, not through anything dramatic. I found out because I have a Google alert set for my company name, standard practice, basic reputation management, something every founder should do. And one morning in November, while I was drinking coffee at my kitchen table in Austin, I received an alert that contained a cached excerpt from a deal sourcing database used by private equity firms, in which my company had been listed as a potential acquisition target under a search conducted by a firm whose contact email, when I traced it through 3 layers of corporate registration, resolved to a holding company whose registered agent was a man named Gerald Foss, who appeared on the website of my Uncle Mark's firm as Director of Acquisition Research. My company, listed as a target by my uncle's firm, 7 months before he would sit at my mother's graduation party table pretending he had just heard about it. I sat with that information for 4 days before I decided what to do with it. Not because I was frightened, not because I was unsure of my position, but because I had learned from 37 years of being underestimated that the first instinct to respond immediately, to confront, to demonstrate, is almost always the instinct that costs you the most and gains you the least. I called my attorney instead. Her name is Renata. She is 44 years old. She has the specific quality of calm that comes from having seen more than most people see in a professional lifetime, and having decided that composure is more useful than reaction in every situation she has encountered. I told her what I had found. She said, "How long has he been looking?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "Find out. Don't move until you know the full shape of it." I spent the next 3 weeks finding out. And the shape of it, when I could finally see the full outline, was considerably larger than a private equity firm doing routine deal sourcing. My uncle had not simply listed my company as a target. He had been actively building a strategy around it, and the strategy had a piece in it that I had not expected, and that changed the nature of what he was doing from opportunistic to deliberate. And the piece that changed everything was my mother. She didn't know she was part of it. I am almost certain of that. But she was in it nonetheless, and understanding how she had gotten there without knowing she was there is what took me from simply being a founder with a sophisticated uncle interested in her company to being a woman sitting at a graduation party with a room full of people and a plan that had been building for 7 months, waiting for exactly the right moment to become visible. The piece that connected my mother to my uncle's acquisition strategy was not money, not directly, not yet. It was information. Specifically, it was the particular category of information that only a person's family can provide. The kind that does not appear in a business registry or a financial filing or a due diligence database. The kind that describes not what a company is worth on paper, but what its founder is worth as a person, what she will accept, what she will resist. What pressure points exist in her life that a sufficiently informed acquirer could apply to make a deal happen at a price significantly below. what the asset actually merits. My uncle had been talking to my mother for 8 months. I know the exact duration because Renata, once I had described what I suspected, connected me with a forensic digital consultant named Paul, who specialized in mapping communication patterns between parties in corporate disputes. And Paul spent 2 weeks pulling publicly available data, social media interactions, cross-referenced with phone records I obtained through my own account since my mother and I shared a family plan she had never updated, a detail she had overlooked and I had not, and what he assembled was a communication timeline that showed my uncle calling my mother approximately once every 3 weeks beginning the previous October, which was a significant increase from his historical pattern of calling her roughly 4 times a year at holidays and birthdays. 8 months of accelerated contact. 8 months of conversations I had not been present for, between a man who built acquisition strategies for a living and a woman who believed her daughter ran a small consulting business that was still figuring itself out. I thought about what my mother knew. I inventoried it the way I inventory everything, systematically, without editorializing. She knew I lived in Austin. She knew I had employees because I had mentioned it once and she had responded by asking whether I was sure I could afford them, which was the kind of response that trains you to limit future disclosures. She knew the name of my company because it appeared on my email signature, which she occasionally replied to without apparently registering what the signature contained. She knew I worked with corporate clients because I had described one project in broad terms at a family dinner 3 years prior, and she had said that sounds complicated, sweetheart, in the tone she used when she wanted to be supportive and could not locate the specific support required. What she did not know was the revenue, the client list, the valuation, the fact that I had received and declined 2 acquisition offers in the previous 18 months, both from firms significantly larger than my uncle's, both at numbers that would have made the follow-through comment land very differently if she had known about them. She did not know these things because I had not told her, and I had not told her because I had learned at 19, at 23, at 26, at 29, at 32, and at every calibration point in between that the people who have decided what you are capable of will interpret evidence of your capability not as a revision of their assessment, but as an anomaly requiring explanation. If I had told my mother my company was worth what it was worth, she would not have said I was wrong about her. She would have said, "Are you sure?" Or she would have called Callaway to ask him if that sounded right. Or she would have mentioned it to Uncle Mark at the next available opportunity, because Uncle Mark understood business and could verify it, which is exactly what had apparently happened with the scraps of information she did possess. Because that was the piece I had not yet fully mapped when I first found the acquisition alert in November. I had assumed my uncle's interest had originated independently through normal deal sourcing, and that the connection to my mother was incidental. Paul's timeline revised that assumption. The acceleration in contact had begun in October, which was 1 month after a family dinner in September at which I had been present and at which my mother had mentioned, in the context of a conversation about holiday plans, that Elena is actually doing quite well with her little company. She has real clients now, which was the warmest public endorsement she had ever given my work and which I had registered at the time as progress and now understood as the data point that had activated my uncle's interest. My mother had, without knowing it, flagged my company to a private equity operator by doing the one thing I had spent years inadvertently preventing her from doing. She had said something positive about my work in a room where my uncle was listening. He had done what he always did with information that arrived in a social context. He had filed it. He had researched it. He had found a company that was significantly more valuable than his sister's description of a little company with real clients had suggested, and he had begun the quiet, systematic process of building a strategy around acquiring it at the lowest possible price. The lowest possible price required a motivated seller. A motivated seller required pressure. Pressure, in his model, required understanding the seller's vulnerabilities. And the most efficient path to understanding a founder's vulnerabilities, when that founder was your niece and her mother was your sister, was to call your sister every 3 weeks for 8 months and ask about the family while listening for the specific information that would tell you whether the founder was financially stretched, professionally isolated, personally destabilized, or otherwise in a condition that would make a below-market offer feel like relief rather than insult. He had not found what he was looking for. Because my mother, despite 8 months of providing the raw material of family conversation to a man who was mining it for acquisition intelligence, did not actually know enough about my real position to give him the pressure points he needed. My company was not financially stretched. I was not professionally isolated. I had 2 declined acquisition offers in the previous 18 months that had been negotiated and declined with the kind of precision that comes from having a very good attorney and a very clear understanding of what you have built and what it is worth. I was, in the language of deal sourcing, not a motivated seller, which meant my uncle's strategy had arrived at an impasse. And impasses for men like my uncle produce escalation rather than withdrawal. The escalation came in January, for months before the graduation party, in the form of a phone call I received from a number I did not recognize that turned out to be a junior associate at my uncle's firm, calling to express interest in a strategic partnership conversation with my company. Not an acquisition offer, a partnership conversation, which is the specific framing used when an acquirer wants to open a door without triggering the defensive response that the word acquisition produces in a founder who is not yet ready to sell. I listened to the full pitch. I asked 3 questions that sounded like interest. I thanked him and said I would be in touch. I hung up and called Renata immediately. She said, partnership conversation is stage 1 of a 4-stage approach they use when direct outreach hasn't been tried yet. It means they've decided to move from research to contact. I said, the contact came from a junior associate, not from Mark directly. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he doesn't want you to know it's him yet. I said, he thinks I don't know the firm is connected to him. She said, does he have any reason to think you do know? I said, no. She said, then don't give him one. I did not return the associate's call. I did not acknowledge the outreach through any channel. I let it sit in the unanswered column of my professional correspondence, and I watched what happened next, because Renata had taught me that the response to silence from a target tells you more about the acquirer's actual position than anything they say when they believe you are engaged. What happened next was that the associate called again 3 weeks later. Then a second associate called 2 weeks after that with a slightly different framing, not partnership, but collaboration opportunity, which was stage 2 in the 4-stage approach Renata had described. Then in March, 2 months before the graduation party, I received an email directly from my uncle's firm, not from my uncle himself, still not from him, but from his firm's managing director, expressing interest in a preliminary conversation. 3 contacts in 12 weeks, escalating in seniority, each one slightly more direct than the last. The strategy was unmistakable to anyone who understood it and invisible to anyone who did not. He was turning up the temperature slowly enough that a founder who did not know the pattern would simply experience it as increasing interest from a credible firm without recognizing that the interest had a personal architecture behind it and a below-market offer waiting at the end of it. I knew the pattern. I also knew something else now that I had not known in November. Something Paul had found in the communication timeline that I had been sitting with for 6 weeks by the time the graduation party invitation arrived in my inbox, and I read my niece Jessica's name on it and understood. With the specific clarity of someone who has been building toward a moment for long enough that the moment's arrival feels less like surprise and more like confirmation that the room I had been constructing for 7 months had just announced its date. The thing Paul had found in the communication timeline, the thing I had been sitting with for 6 weeks before the graduation invitation arrived, was a name. Not my uncle's name, not my mother's, not anyone I had expected to find in the architecture of what my uncle was building. The name was Richard Calloway, my brother. I want to be precise about what the timeline showed and what it did not show, because I am not a person who constructs narratives from incomplete data, and I was not going to start in the middle of a situation that required more precision than I had ever applied to anything. What the timeline showed was that my brother Calloway had been in direct phone contact with my uncle's firm, not with my uncle personally, with the firm's main line and with the managing director's direct number on 4 separate occasions between November and February. The calls were not long. 8 minutes, 12 minutes, 6 minutes, 9 minutes. But they were consistent and they were recent and they had occurred in the same window as the escalating outreach to my company, which meant the probability that they were unrelated was low enough that Renata, when I showed her the data, used the word coordinated without me prompting her. I sat with that word for a long time. Coordinated. Not coincidental, not parallel, not independently occurring. Coordinated, which implies awareness, which implies agreement, which implies that my brother, my sensible, linear, junior partner brother who bought a house 12 minutes from my parents and produced 2 children who sat still at dinner, had been in contact with the firm that was running a below-market acquisition strategy against my company while I was sitting at family dinners being described as still figuring things out. I did not confront Callaway. I want to be very clear about that because the impulse to confront was present and I made a deliberate decision to override it. And the decision was not passive and it was not avoidance. It was strategy. Because the moment I confronted Callaway, the coordination became visible to the people running it. And the moment it became visible, they would adjust. And the adjusted version of the strategy would be harder to document and harder to counter than the version currently running on the assumption that I was unaware of it. I needed them to keep running the strategy they had. I needed them to arrive at the graduation party in May believing that Elena Callaway, the creative one, the still figuring it out one, the woman whose mother had been providing family intelligence to a private equity operator for 8 months without knowing that was what she was doing, was exactly as unaware and as manageable as they had assessed her to be. So I did what I had been doing since November. I documented everything. I filed everything away. And I began building the counterposition with Renata in the specific, methodical way that my father's quiet and my mother's dismissal and my uncle's charm and my brother's compliance had spent 37 years inadvertently training me to build things, without announcement, without visible effort, without giving anyone around me the information they would need to understand what I was constructing until it was already complete. Renata and I met 4 times between Paul's discovery and the graduation party. The meetings were not dramatic. They were the specific, unglamorous work of preparation, reviewing corporate documents, stress testing the ownership structure of my company against every angle of approach my uncle's firm might use, ensuring that every element of my position was legally clean and completely documented. My company's ownership structure was straightforward. I held 68%. 2 early employees held minority stakes that were clearly defined and legally protected. There were no loose edges, no ambiguous instruments, no gaps in the documentation that an aggressive acquirer could use as leverage. My father had taught me that without intending to, in the same way my mother had taught me to protect things by dismissing them. He had spent his professional life as a contract attorney before he retired, and the one sustained piece of career advice he had ever given me, delivered over a dinner when I was 27, was that the most expensive thing a founder can do is build something valuable and document it carelessly. I had not documented carelessly. Renata confirmed this with the specific satisfaction of an attorney who has reviewed a client's corporate structure and found it constructed more soundly than most of what crosses her desk from founders twice the age and 10 times the public profile. She said, "There is no angle from which this is vulnerable to a hostile approach." I said, "What about an approach that goes through family?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me exactly what you mean by that." I told her about Callaway, about the 4 calls, about the timeline. She listened without interrupting, which was her default setting when receiving information. She was simultaneously processing and filing. When I finished, she said, "If your brother has been providing information to a firm conducting due diligence on your company without your knowledge, that is potentially a breach of the fiduciary duty he owes you as a family member with knowledge of your business affairs, depending on what he disclosed and in what context." I said, "I don't know what he disclosed." She said, "We need to know." The process of finding out what Callaway had disclosed took 3 weeks and involved a level of methodical patience that I want to describe accurately because I think the how of it matters as much as the what. I did not confront him. I did not ask him directly. I invited him to lunch under the pretense of wanting advice on a business decision. Specifically, I told him I was considering a significant expansion and wanted his perspective as someone with corporate finance experience, which was both true in a general sense and precisely calculated to produce the response I was looking for. He arrived at the lunch with the specific energy of a man who has been asked to provide expertise and is genuinely pleased to be asked, because Callaway's relationship to my professional life had always been characterized by the assumption that his corporate experience made him more qualified to assess my business than I was, and an invitation to consult felt to him like the natural correction of a long imbalance. I let him talk. I asked questions that sounded like a founder seeking input, but were structured like an audit. What would a firm like Uncle Mark's look for in a company at my stage? How would they assess revenue quality? What would they consider a red flag in an ownership structure? What information would they typically seek from people who knew the founder personally? He answered all of it with genuine engagement and increasing specificity. And by the end of the lunch, I had a sufficiently clear picture of what he understood about due diligence processes to know that the 4 calls to my uncle's firm had not been incidental family conversation. He knew the language. He knew the framework. He had used both with a fluency that does not come from a single lunch with an uncle. It comes from sustained conversation with people who do this work, and the sustained conversation had clearly been happening. I drove back to my office after the lunch and called Renata and told her what I had observed. She said, "He's been coaching them on how to approach you." I said, "Yes." She said, "Does he know the valuation?" I thought about every conversation I had ever had with Callaway about my business, the carefully limited disclosures, the vague descriptions of clients and projects, the consistent withholding of specific numbers. I said no. I never told him the valuation. Renata said, "Then the strategy has been running on incomplete information. They know enough to approach, but not enough to know whether their offer will be competitive." I said, "Which is why they've been escalating the contact. They're trying to generate a conversation that gets them to the number." She said, "And if they get to the number before you want them to, they can price an offer that sounds significant to someone who doesn't know the full value." I said, "Like my mother." There was a pause. Then Renata said, "Walk me through that." I explained the specific danger as I understood it, which was this. If my uncle's firm made an offer that sounded large in absolute terms, but was significantly below actual value, and if that offer was communicated to my mother before I had the opportunity to establish the correct context, my mother would respond to the number as impressive because she had no framework for assessing it, and her response would be used to create social pressure, family pressure, the specific kind that Patricia Callaway was capable of generating without being aware she was being used to generate it toward acceptance. The strategy was not hostile in the legal sense. It was familial. It used the architecture of my family's existing dynamics, my mother's dismissal of my professional judgment, Callaway's assumption of financial expertise, my uncle's charm and his access to both of them as the mechanism of pressure. It was, in its own way, elegant. It was also the thing I had been building against for 7 months. And I want to pause here for a moment because I need to ask you something directly. Drop a message in the comments right now, wherever you are, because I've been getting messages from people in situations that rhyme with this one, people whose families have underestimated them for so long that the underestimation has become structural. And I want to know how many of you are in this room right now. Because what I'm about to tell you about the 2 weeks before the graduation party is the part where everything I had built in 7 months started to become something that could not be undone. The graduation party invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Jessica, my niece, Callaway's eldest daughter, was graduating from her undergraduate program, and the party was a backyard event at my parents' house in Scottsdale on the 3rd Saturday of May, which was exactly 6 days after my uncle's firm had sent the third and most direct piece of outreach. The email from the managing director that had not yet been responded to, sitting in my inbox like a door that had been knocked on and not yet answered. I called Jessica directly when the invitation arrived. Not to discuss the party, to confirm something I had suspected about her awareness of the situation, because Jessica was 22 and sharp in the specific way of people who have grown up in rooms where adults talk business without adjusting their volume. And I had always had more of a real relationship with her than the family dynamics had made easily visible. She confirmed, in the course of a 20-minute phone call that covered her graduation, her plans, and eventually the upcoming party, that Uncle Mark had mentioned to her father that he was hoping to connect with me at the event, and that Callaway had told her it was about a business opportunity, and that Jessica, who was sharp and who paid attention, had noted the specific quality of enthusiasm in her father's voice when he said business opportunity and had found it slightly unusual given that her father did not typically discuss my business with any particular enthusiasm. She did not know the details. She did not need to know the details. What she had given me was the confirmation that my uncle intended to use the graduation party as the social context for the approach. Not a formal meeting, not a business lunch, a family party, which is the most disarming possible environment for a below-market acquisition conversation, because it surrounds the transaction with warmth and history and the specific obligation of family goodwill that makes it difficult to respond with the precision the situation deserves without appearing ungrateful or combative. He was going to use my family's backyard and my niece's graduation and my mother's champagne flutes to make me feel like declining his offer would be the unreasonable position. I spent the 10 days between that phone call and the party completing the preparation Renata and I had been building toward for 7 months. I will not give you every procedural detail because some of it belongs to the legal record and some of it belongs to the professional relationships that made it possible. But I will tell you the essential architecture of what I walked into that backyard carrying, because the architecture is the point. I had a fully documented valuation from an independent firm, completed 3 weeks prior, that established my company's current market value at a number that would reframe every conversation my uncle had been building toward. I had a complete record of the outreach timeline, every contact from his firm, dated and documented, including the escalating sequence that Paul had mapped and Renata had analyzed. I had the communication records showing my uncle's 8 months of accelerated contact with my mother. I had the data points from the lunch with Calloway that demonstrated his involvement in the due diligence process. And I had something else, something I had not yet described, something that had arrived 4 days before the party in an email from the managing director of my uncle's firm that contained, for the first time in 7 months of contact, an actual number. The offer was real. It was formal. It was attached to a 2-page term sheet that Renata reviewed within the hour and described in her precise and measured way, as aggressive in its assumptions and optimistic in its framing, which was her professional language for an offer structured to sound significant to someone who did not know what their company was actually worth. The number was less than 40% of the independent valuation. I printed the term sheet. I put it in a folder. I put the folder in my bag, and I drove to Scottsdale. I arrived at my parents' house in Scottsdale at 11:45 on a Saturday morning, 15 minutes before the party was scheduled to begin, which was deliberate because arriving early meant I could read the room before the room filled with people, and the social performance my mother had been preparing for this event made reading it significantly more difficult. The house looked the way it always looked for events my mother organized, precise, curated, every element of the backyard arranged to communicate a specific version of the Calloway family to the 40 people who would be standing inside it within the hour. String lights over the patio, catered food displayed on linen-covered tables, a banner for Jessica in the school colors, flowers that coordinated without matching, the particular aesthetic of a woman who understood that the most powerful statement a space could make was the appearance of effortless abundance. My mother was in the kitchen when I came through. She looked at my dress. Navy, clean lines, no ornamentation, the kind of garment that communicates that the person wearing it has made a decision and does not require external confirmation of it, and said, "You look nice, Elena." Simple. She meant simple as a gentle correction. I said, "Thank you, Mom. Everything looks beautiful." I meant it without irony because I have never needed to use irony with my mother to protect myself. I have always used something more durable than irony. I put my bag down in the spare room, checked the folder was where I had placed it, and went back outside. Jessica found me first. She crossed the yard in the specific way of a 22-year-old who is excited and trying not to perform excitement too obviously, and she hugged me with genuine warmth and said, "I'm really glad you came." I said I wouldn't miss it. "Congratulations, Jess. I mean that completely." She looked at me for a moment with the sharp eyes I had always liked about her. She said quietly, "He's already here." I said, "I know. I saw his car." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm excellent." She studied my face for another second, found what she was apparently looking for, nodded once, and went to greet the next arriving guest. Uncle Mark was standing near the back fence with a glass of sparkling water, talking to my father in the relaxed posture of a man who has arrived somewhere he considers home territory and has no reason to adjust his comfort level. He was wearing a light gray shirt, open collar, the specific informality of someone who wants to communicate that he is at a family party and not a business meeting. which is exactly what you wear when you intend to conduct a business meeting at a family party. He saw me cross the yard. His face did the thing I had watched it do since I was 19. The warm, immediate, genuinely practiced smile of a man for whom charm is a professional instrument deployed with such consistency that it has become indistinguishable from his actual personality. He said, "Elena, you look wonderful." I said, "Uncle Mark, good to see you." My father said, "Your sister was just saying you've been busy with work." I said, "Always." My uncle's eyes were doing the thing his eyes always did. Filing. He said, "I've been meaning to catch up with you about that, actually. I've been hearing good things." I said, "That's kind." He said, "Maybe we can find a few minutes today." I said, "I'd like that." I moved away before he could establish the specific conversational momentum that a man like my uncle builds when he wants to set the terms of a discussion in advance, because I had been in enough rooms with him to know that the first 3 minutes of any conversation he considers important are dedicated to calibration. He is reading you, adjusting his approach, establishing the register he intends to use. And I did not want to give him 3 minutes of calibration material before the room was full. The party assembled itself over the following 40 minutes in the particular way of Scottsdale afternoon gatherings. People arriving in clusters, the specific social sorting that happens when a room contains both family and friends, the gradual increase in volume as the event finds its register. Calloway arrived with his wife and his 2 children who sat still at dinner. He found me near the food table and gave me the hug of a man who is performing normalcy with slightly more effort than normalcy actually requires, and I hugged him back with exactly the warmth the moment called for and nothing more. He said, "Good to see you, Elle." I said, "You too. Just look so happy." He said, "She worked hard." I said, "She did." We stood together for a moment in the specific silence of siblings who have more to say than the context permits. And then his wife pulled him toward another cluster of guests, and I watched him go and thought about the 4 phone calls and the lunch and the fluency in due diligence language and said nothing. My mother gave her toast at 12:30. It was warm and precise and built around Jessica in the way my mother built things around the people she was proudest of, generously, publicly, with the specific investment of a woman who understood that a well-delivered compliment in the right room was a form of currency. She talked about Jessica's persistence, her focus, her follow-through. She used the word follow-through twice. I noted it both times without expression. Then she looked around the table with the satisfied warmth of a woman surveying a room she had assembled and considered the assembly a reflection of herself. And she said, "We are just so proud. Not everyone in this family has this kind of follow-through." She was not looking at me when she said it. She did not need to. The comment was not aimed like a dart. It was released like a weather pattern, general and atmospheric, and everyone at the table had enough family context to know where it settled. I watched 3 people look at me. I watched 2 people look away. I picked up my glass and drank from it, and my face did nothing. Then Uncle Mark leaned forward from the end of the table. He had been waiting for a transition, an opening, the moment when the formal portion of the afternoon gave way to the social portion, where conversations became possible without the interruption of structured programming. He had clearly decided that my mother's toast had created sufficient transition. He said, "Speaking of which, someone was telling me about your company, Elena. Can you tell us what it's actually worth?" The table shifted, not dramatically, a subtle recalibration, the specific quality of attention that a room produces when a question has been asked that contains more than its surface. My mother's expression moved through something I had not seen before. A flicker of the specific surprise of a person who has just realized they are in a conversation whose dimensions they did not know existed. I looked at my uncle across the table. He was smiling, the warm, practiced, professionally calibrated smile. His eyes were working. I said, "That's a great question, Mark. Why don't you tell me what you've heard, and I'll tell you how accurate it is." The smile held. His eyes adjusted. A very small recalibration, visible only to someone who had been watching his face for 37 years and knew the difference between the smile that meant he was comfortable and the smile that meant he was recalculating. He said, "I've heard you've built something impressive." I said, "We have." He said, "The firm has been following some companies in your space. I think there might be an interesting conversation to be had." I said, "I think so too." He said, maybe after the party we could find some time. I said, we don't need to wait. The table went fully quiet. My mother set down her fork. Calloway, 3 seats to my left, became very still in the specific way of a man who has just realized the conversation has arrived at a place he was not prepared for it to arrive at publicly. Uncle Mark's smile was intact, but his eyes were doing something different now. Not the comfortable working assessment of a man reading a target, but the sharper, faster recalculation of a man who has just discovered that the conversation he prepared for and the conversation he is in are not the same conversation. He said, I appreciate the enthusiasm, though maybe this isn't the time or place for business. I said, you brought it up at a family party. I think this is exactly the right time and place. I reached down to the bag at my feet. I took out the folder. I set it on the table between my champagne glass and my mother's centerpiece flowers. I said, your firm sent me a term sheet 4 days ago. I'd like to discuss it here with the family, since the family appears to have been involved in the process. The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. My mother's hand was flat on the table. Calloway was looking at the folder. My uncle was looking at me with the specific expression of a man who has spent a career reading other people and has just encountered someone who has been reading him back for 7 months and has been waiting for exactly this room to show it. The folder sat on the table between my champagne glass and my mother's flowers, and nobody moved toward it and nobody moved away from it. And the specific quality of the silence in that backyard in that moment was the silence of 40 people simultaneously recalibrating the event they believed they were attending. I had been in enough rooms where significant information was introduced unexpectedly to know that the first 15 seconds after the introduction are the most important 15 seconds in the room, because what happens in them sets the register for everything that follows. And what happens in them is almost entirely determined by the person who introduced the information and how they occupy the space they have just created. I occupied it by doing nothing. I sat with my hands in my lap, my posture unchanged from what it had been throughout the lunch. My expression at the specific temperature I had been maintaining since I arrived at 11:45. Present, composed, neither warm nor cold. The expression of a woman who has arrived somewhere she intended to arrive and is in no hurry to move through it faster than it needs to move. My uncle recovered first because he was very good at recovering, and because recovery was a professional skill he had spent decades refining in rooms considerably higher stakes than his sister's backyard graduation party. He said, Elena, I think we should take this conversation somewhere private. His voice was smooth. The smile was adjusted, less warm, more measured, the register of a man who has shifted from social mode to professional mode without wanting the room to register the shift. I said, I've been thinking about that, actually, and I think the people at this table deserve to hear it, since several of them have been part of the process. Calloway made a sound that was not quite a word. My mother said, what process? I looked at her. Not with anger. I want to be precise about this, because anger was not what I was carrying into that moment, and it would have been the wrong instrument for what the moment required. I looked at her with the specific steadiness of someone who is about to give a person they love information that will be difficult to receive, and has decided that the most respectful thing they can do is deliver it clearly. I said, Mom, Uncle Mark's firm has been building an acquisition strategy for my company for the past 7 months. During that time, he has been in regular contact with you, approximately every 3 weeks, and in contact with Calloway on at least 4 occasions. My mother's face moved through 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds. The first was confusion. The second was the specific confusion of a person whose confusion is beginning to resolve into something more uncomfortable than confusion. The third was something I had not seen on my mother's face directed toward her brother before, and which I recognized as the beginning of the recalibration that happens when a person realizes they have been a component in a mechanism they did not know they were inside. She said, Mark, what is she talking about? My uncle said, Patricia, this is a mischaracterization of a straightforward business interest. I said, let me show you what straightforward looks like. I opened the folder. I did not hand it to anyone. I placed the documents on the table in the specific sequence Renata and I had discussed. Not because the sequence was dramatic, but because the sequence was logical, and logical presentation is the most durable kind, because it does not depend on emotion to land, and does not require the audience to feel anything in particular to understand it. The first document was the communication timeline Paul had assembled. I said, this is a record of contact between Uncle Mark's firm and this family over the past 8 months. The green entries are calls to this household. The blue entries are calls to Calloway's direct number. The dates on the right column correspond to the escalating outreach my company received from the firm. I let people look at it. My mother was looking at the green entries. She was counting them. I could see her doing it, running her finger down the column without touching the paper, and her expression as she counted was the expression of a person discovering that a pattern they were inside was more structured than they had been aware of from the inside. Calloway was not looking at the document. He was looking at the table. My uncle said, a communication record doesn't establish anything improper. I said, you're right, which is why I have this. The second document was the term sheet. I placed it face up on the table beside the timeline. I said, this is the acquisition offer your firm sent me 4 days ago. The number on page 1 is the proposed purchase price. My mother looked at the number. I watched her look at it. She said the number quietly, almost to herself, the way people say numbers when they are trying to calibrate them against an internal reference point. She said, is that a lot? I said, it depends on what you're comparing it to. I placed the third document on the table, the independent valuation. I said, this is a third-party valuation of my company completed 3 weeks ago by an independent firm. The number on page 2 is the current market value. My mother looked at the valuation number and then looked at the term sheet number and then looked at them both again, and the distance between those two numbers was visible on her face as a physical thing, not mathematical, not abstract, but immediate and human. The specific comprehension of a person who has just understood that someone they trusted was attempting to acquire their daughter's life's work at less than 40% of its value using information obtained through conversations. With her, she looked at her brother. She said, Mark, not a question, just his name, said in a register I had never heard from my mother directed at her brother. A register that contained within it the specific weight of a woman whose trust has just been quantified and found to have been used as a tool. My uncle looked at her with the practiced steadiness of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and knows that the most dangerous thing he can do in this one is show the recalculation happening behind his eyes. He said, Patricia, the valuation methodology in documents like that one is often. I said, the firm that prepared it has produced valuations in 43 acquisition transactions in the last 4 years. Their methodology is available for review. Renata can send it to whoever would like to see it. He looked at me. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone who was not looking for it, but I was looking for it and I saw it. The specific shift of a man who has just understood that the person across from him has not been surprised by this conversation, has not been caught off guard by this gathering, has not responded impulsively to a family moment. The shift of a man who understands in real time that he is not in the room he prepared for. He said, you've been building a case. I said, I've been doing my due diligence. Someone at the far end of the table, a family friend, I think, someone my mother had invited from her book club, said something quietly to the person beside her, and they both looked at their plates. I noticed it without acknowledging it because the room's social temperature was not my primary concern, and managing it was not my job. My uncle tried a different register. He leaned back slightly and said, Elena, I want to be clear that my firm's interest in your company is genuine, and the offer is a starting point, not a final position. These conversations always begin somewhere. I said they do, and I'm happy to have the conversation, but I want to have it accurately. So I need to address the methodology question you were about to raise, because I think it's important that everyone at this table understands the number correctly. I looked at my mother when I said everyone at this table, not to embarrass her, but because she was the person whose understanding mattered most in this specific moment, and she needed to know I was talking to her as much as I was talking to him. I said, the valuation methodology accounts for 3 revenue streams: recurring client contracts, proprietary process licensing, and a software tool my team built 18 months ago that we have been licensing to 3 firms in the space. The licensing revenue alone represents a component that your firm's term sheet does not appear to have accounted for, which suggests the due diligence on which the offer was based is incomplete. My uncle said, "We'd want to review the licensing agreements before." I said, "I have them." 4th document. The licensing summary Renata had prepared, 3 pages, clean and spare, showing the 3 agreements, the annual revenue, the renewal terms, and the growth trajectory over 18 months. I placed it on the table. The table now had 4 documents on it, and my mother's flowers had been moved to the side to make room for them, which I had not planned, but which felt, in the moment, like the correct visual representation of what was happening. The family occasion making room for the actual dimensions of what the occasion had contained without anyone at it knowing. I want to pause for just a second because I know people are watching this right now who are in some version of a room like this one. A room where someone who was supposed to be in your corner was quietly working against you, using your family's expectations as the mechanism. And if that's you, I want you to stay with this, because what happened in the next 4 minutes is the part that I built 7 months of preparation for, and it arrived not with drama, but with the specific undeniable weight of documentation presented in the right room at the right moment to the right people. And if you've been here since the beginning, since the hook, since the backyard and the follow-through comment and the question about what my company was worth, hit that subscribe button right now, because what my uncle said next is what told me everything I needed to know about exactly how this had been designed and exactly how completely the design had failed. He said, "You should have come to me directly. If you wanted to discuss a transaction, we could have had this conversation privately months ago." I said, "You contacted my company 3 times through intermediaries before sending a term sheet. At no point did you identify yourself as the principal. At no point did you disclose your relationship to me as your niece. At no point did you inform me that you had been in contact with my mother and my brother as part of your approach." He said, "That's standard deal process." I said, "It's standard when the target is a stranger. When the target is your niece and the information pipeline runs through your sister and her son, it's something else." My mother said, "Calloway." My brother looked up. She said his name the same way she had said Mark's, just the name. In the register, that is not a question and is not an accusation, but is the specific sound of a person who has understood something and needs the person she is looking at to know that she has understood it. Calloway said, "Mom, she said, "You were just what?" It was not a question. He said, "Mark asked me some questions about Elena's business." "I didn't think it was," she said. "You didn't think." And then something happened that I had not prepared for and had not anticipated, and which I have thought about every day since, because it was the most unexpected thing that occurred in that backyard, and it came from the most unexpected direction. My mother looked at me directly, fully, without the qualifier, without the asterisk, without the specific warmth she deployed when she wanted to manage the temperature of a room at someone else's expense. She looked at me the way I had wanted her to look at me for 37 years, with the specific expression of a person who is seeing something clearly that they have been seeing incorrectly for a very long time. And she said, "How long have you known about this?" I said, 7 months. She said, "And you didn't say anything." I said, "I needed to understand the full shape of it first." She looked at the 4 documents on the table. She looked at the valuation number. She looked at the term sheet number. She looked at the distance between them. And then she said, quietly and without performance and without the specific management of impression that had characterized every significant statement she had made in my presence for as long as I could remember, "I didn't know what you had built." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have." 3 words, 12 letters. The most direct thing my mother had said to me in 37 years, delivered at a backyard graduation party in Scottsdale in front of 40 people, and 4 documents, and a champagne glass that had been sitting untouched in front of me since the toast. My uncle was looking at the table. Not at me, not at my mother, not at the documents. At the table, the specific posture of a man whose room has changed beneath him and who is still in the process of finding the new floor. Calloway was looking at his hands. 2 of the family friends had quietly relocated to the far end of the yard near the food table. The instinctive social migration that happens when a space becomes too charged for a comfortable occupation. Jessica was standing near the back fence looking at me with the sharp eyes I had always liked and the specific expression of someone who had suspected something was coming and was processing the gap between what they suspected and what actually arrived. The folder was still open on the table. The 4 documents were still visible. And my uncle had not yet said the thing that was going to define the rest of his professional reputation in this family. But I could see it coming, the way you can see a decision forming in someone's face before they make it. And it was coming because men like my uncle, when they have been exposed in a room they did not expect to be exposed in, have 2 available responses: graceful acknowledgement or doubling down. And graceful acknowledgement requires a quality of self-awareness that the architecture of his career had not developed in him. He looked up from the table. He looked at me, and he said, "You're making a mistake. The market for companies in your space is cooling. The offer my firm made is fair given current conditions, and if you pass on it, you'll spend the next 2 years wishing you hadn't." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, 3 firms have valued my company in the last 18 months. Your offer represents 38% of the lowest of those 3 valuations. The licensing revenue, your due diligence missed, accounts for the majority of the gap. And the communication strategy your firm used to approach me, through my mother, through my brother, without identifying yourself as the principal, is documented in detail and has been reviewed by my attorney. I paused. Then I said, "I'm not making a mistake. I know exactly what I have. I've known for a long time. The only people in this yard who didn't know were the ones who decided not to ask." My uncle left 20 minutes after I said it. Not dramatically. He did not push back from the table or raise his voice or perform the specific theater of a man whose dignity has been publicly challenged. He simply finished what was in his glass, folded his napkin with the particular neatness of someone who needs to do something with their hands, said something quiet to my father that I could not hear from where I was sitting, and walked through the side gate to his car. The gate closed behind him with the small, metallic sound of a latch finding its housing, and that sound was the most precise punctuation I have ever heard at the end of a sentence that had taken 7 months to write. Calloway left 30 minutes after that. He found me near the food table before he went, which told me he had been working up to the conversation rather than avoiding it, and he stood in front of me with the specific posture of a man who has been trying to locate his position in a situation that has shifted beneath him and has not yet fully found it. He said, "I didn't know the full picture." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I should have asked you directly." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry, Elena." I looked at him, not with the accumulated 37 years of the secondary sibling in its full weight, not with the lunch and the 4 calls and the due diligence language in my eyes, with the specific clarity of a woman who has spent 7 months building something precise and has just watched it function exactly as designed and is now in the first moments of the space that follows completion. I said, "I know you are." He nodded. He squeezed my arm once, briefly, in the way of someone who wants to say more than the moment permits and is being honest about the limitation. Then he left. The party continued. That is the part that people find surprising when I tell this story, and which I think is actually the most honest thing about it. The party continued. Jessica blew out the candles on her cake. People ate the catered food. The string lights came on as the afternoon moved toward evening. My mother circulated through her guests with the practiced warmth of a woman who knows how to maintain the social temperature of a room she has assembled, and she did it well because she was genuinely good at it. And because the show going on around an absence is what people at parties do when the alternative is acknowledging that something significant has just happened in front of all of them. I stayed until the end. Not because I needed to demonstrate anything, or because leaving early would have communicated something I wanted to avoid communicating. I stayed because Jessica had asked me to stay and because Jessica's graduation was the actual occasion, and I was not going to let what had happened at the table reduce it to a backdrop for a confrontation. We sat together on the back steps after the last guest left, before the cleanup began, in the specific quiet of a yard that has held 40 people and has just been given back to itself. She said, "Did you know he was going to bring it up today?" I said, "I knew he intended to. I didn't know your grandmother was going to give him the opening she gave him." She said, the follow-through comment. I said, "She does it without knowing she's doing it. She's been doing it my whole life. Today it just happened to set up a different kind of conversation than she intended. Jessica was quiet for a moment. She said what she said after, that she didn't know what you'd built. I said yes. She said, was that enough? I thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about. I said it was real. That's different from enough, but it's where real things start. She looked at the yard. The string lights were still on, casting the specific warm light of an occasion that has ended, but not yet been officially dismantled. She said, she talks about you differently than you think she does, you know, when you're not there. I looked at her. She said, she tells her friends you're the brave one. She says it like she's proud and also like it frightens her a little. I sat with that for a long time without responding because it was the kind of information that requires sitting with rather than responding to, the kind that rearranges something quietly rather than loudly and whose full effect takes longer than a single evening to assess. I drove back to my hotel. I had booked a hotel rather than staying at my parents' house, a decision I had made months earlier for the practical reason that I needed a space that was fully mine during a weekend that was not going to be simple, and which turned out to be correct for reasons beyond what I had originally anticipated. I sat on the edge of the bed and called Renata. She answered on the second ring and said, how did it go? I told her. She listened without interrupting, which was her default and which I had learned to read as engagement rather than silence. When I finished, she said, the term sheet is off the table. I said, yes. She said, he won't come back with a revised offer. Not after a room like that. I said, I know. She said, are you okay? I said, yes. I think I actually am. She said, good. Because I got a call this afternoon while you were at the party. The firm that made the second offer 18 months ago has been in touch. They want to revisit the conversation. I said, how seriously? She said, seriously enough that they called me directly rather than going through a junior associate. I said, tell them I'll be ready to talk in 30 days. I want the licensing revenue properly documented in the data room first. She said, already on my list. I thanked her. I put the phone down. I sat in the hotel room in the quiet of a day that had contained more than most days contain, and I did the thing I have always done when something significant has resolved. I opened my notebook and I wrote a list. Not of what had happened, of what was next. Because what is next is always the actual point, and the thing that just happened is only meaningful in relation to what you build from it. The professional aftermath developed over the following 6 weeks with the specific procedural rhythm of consequences that have been properly structured in advance. My uncle's firm did not reach out again. Not to me, not to Renata, not through any of the 3 contact channels they had used over the 7 months prior. The silence from his firm was the specific silence of a strategic withdrawal executed by a professional who understands that the position has been lost and that further contact creates additional exposure without any available upside. Renata confirmed through her own network that his firm had dropped my company from their active targets list within 2 weeks of the graduation party, which meant the decision had been made quickly and without deliberation, which told me that the decision had been easy, which told me that the exposure at the party had been sufficient to remove any remaining ambiguity about whether the approach was viable. Calloway called me 3 weeks after the party. A longer call than our usual ones, less structured, with the specific quality of a conversation between people who are rebuilding something that was damaged and are doing it carefully, because they both understand that the damage was real and that pretending otherwise would undermine the reconstruction. He told me more about the conversations with my uncle's firm than he had been willing to say at the party. Not because I asked him to, but because he had been sitting with it and had decided that full disclosure was the correct posture, which was the most mature decision I had seen him make in our adult relationship. The conversations had been 4 calls over 4 months. My uncle had framed them as seeking family perspective on whether Elena might be open to a conversation about her business future. Calloway had provided what he described as general context, my work style, my relationship to risk, my financial situation as he understood it, which was limited because I had never disclosed specifics to him. He said, I didn't give him anything he could use as leverage. I want you to know that. I said, I know. His offer was built on incomplete information. That was visible in the number. He said, I should have told you he was asking. I said, yes. He said, Why didn't you just tell me what you knew? Why let it go all the way to the party? I said, because I needed to see the full shape of it. And because I needed to know whether you would keep going or whether you would stop when it became real. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's a hard way to find out. I said, you stopped before the term sheet. You didn't give him the valuation. You didn't give him the client list. You didn't give him anything that would have made the offer more accurate. I noticed that. He said, I didn't have that information. I said, I know. But you also stopped returning his calls in February. Paul's timeline showed that. Another silence. He said, you had my call records. I said, publicly available. Family plan. He exhaled slowly, somewhere between frustrated and something more complicated. He said, you're like Dad. I said, I know. We talked for another 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with my uncle or the acquisition or the graduation party. About his daughter who had just graduated, about his younger son who was applying to colleges, about a project at his firm that he was finding interesting in a way he hadn't expected. The conversation was the most genuine one we had had in years, and it arrived through the specific mechanism of a rupture that had been repaired honestly rather than papered over, which is the only kind of repair that actually holds. My mother called on a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after the party. She called at 9, which was when she called when she wanted to talk rather than when she wanted to manage something. And she opened not with warmth management, but with a directness I had not heard from her in this register before. She said, I want to understand what you built. I said, what do you want to know? She said, all of it. From the beginning. I told her. For 2 hours and 20 minutes, I told her the actual story of my company. Not the carefully edited version I had been providing for years as protective measure. Not the broad strokes designed to minimize exposure, but the real version. The folding table in the Austin apartment. The first client, which I had won by outpreparing 3 firms with 10 times my headcount. The first employee, hired on a bet that the second contract would come through before the runway ended, which it did with 11 days to spare. The software tool we had built internally because a client process needed it, and we had built it for ourselves before realizing it had independent value. The 2 declined acquisition offers, the independent valuation, the licensing revenue, the 11 employees, their names, their roles, the specific ways each of them had contributed to building something that was now worth what it was worth. My mother listened for the full 2 hours and 20 minutes. She asked questions. Not the questions of a woman performing interest, but the questions of a woman who is actually trying to understand something she has been looking at incorrectly for a long time and knows it. She asked about the software tool with specific curiosity. She asked how the licensing agreements worked. She asked about the 2 declined offers and why I had declined them, and I told her, and she said, you knew what you had. I said, I've always known. She said, I didn't help you know that. I said, no. She said, I want to tell you something. I tell people you're the brave one. I've been saying it for years. I thought about what Jessica had told me on the back steps. I said, I heard. She said, I should have said it to you. I said, yes, you should have. The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of 2 people who understand each other without words. It was the honest silence of 2 people sitting in the gap between what was and what should have been, which is a more difficult silence, but a more useful one because it contains within it the actual material of change, rather than the performance of resolution. She said, can we start again? I said, we don't start again. We start from here. She said, from here then. The company I told you about, the one my mother did not know existed, the one my uncle had been trying to acquire at 38% of its value using my family as the information pipeline, the one I had built from a folding table in an Austin apartment without announcement or external validation, closed a majority acquisition deal 4 months after the graduation party with the firm that had been in contact with Renata. The deal was structured correctly. The number was accurate. The terms protected the team, the clients, the licensing agreements, and a continuing role for me in the company's next phase that I had negotiated with the precision of someone who had spent 7 months learning exactly what her position was worth and had declined one offer that tried to tell her otherwise. Renata called me when the wire cleared. She said, how do you feel? I said, like I know what follow through actually looks like. She laughed, which was something she did rarely and which I had learned to receive as the specific currency of a person who does not spend it carelessly. I still talk to my mother on Sunday mornings. The conversations are different now, not transformed, not reconstructed into something they were never going to be, but different in the specific way that things are different when the pretense has been removed and what remains is smaller and less polished and considerably more real. She asks about the company. She asks real questions. She says my name at the beginning of sentences without a qualifier attached. Jessica started her first job 2 months after the graduation. She texted me on her first day with a single line. I told my manager my aunt built a company from scratch. She asked if you had any advice for someone starting out. I wrote back, document everything. Build quietly. Know what you have before anyone else tells you what it's worth. She sent back one word, done. And I want to ask you something before you go. Something I've been sitting with since that Sunday morning phone call with my mother, since the closing wire, since the back steps with Jessica, and the string lights, and the specific quiet of a yard being returned to itself after an occasion has ended. The people in your life who have been deciding what you are capable of. Have you ever considered that their certainty about your limitations is not actually about you? That it is about the specific discomfort that someone else's undisclosed capacity produces in people who have organized their understanding of you around a smaller version? I am asking because I spent 37 years absorbing a description of myself that was not accurate and another 7 months building something in the space between that description and the truth. And what I found in that space was not resentment and not vindication and not the clean, satisfying resolution that stories are supposed to arrive at. What I found was the specific, durable, quietly extraordinary feeling of knowing exactly what you have built, exactly what it is worth, and being the only person in the room who was never confused about either. Tell me in the comments what you have been building quietly. I want to know what's in that space.